Thank you for tuning into the DDT Method podcast. I'm Drew Donaldson, and this week we're deep diving into nutrition with Joel Green. Joel is the author of the books The Way and the Immunity Code, and he is a brilliant nutrition expert. He's one of these guys that takes a deep dive approach and looks at things different than most nutrition experts will. He's an expert in all things microbiome and gut health, and he can break down alternative ways to approach building and structuring your diet, not only for optimal body composition and performance, but for optimizing your health. I think you're going to get a lot out of this one, and you're probably going to learn a few approaches that you haven't even considered before. Again, thank you for tuning into the DDT Method podcast, and this is Joel Green. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. This week, we're diving back into the nutritional end of things, and I have with me today Joel Green. Now, Joel is referred to as the original gut health guy by some people, but it goes so much further than that because gut health really ties so much into not only performance, not only aesthetics, not only just strength in general and longevity, it ties into literally everything. So Joel tends to be a guy that can touch on every aspect of whatever your goals might be. And he's got a lot of unique approaches that some of you might not have even considered before. So we're going to go over it all today. But before we really deep dive into any one aspect, Joel, just give us a little bit about yourself for anybody that might not be familiar with you. Who are you? What do you do? And what kind of brought you to the dance and the fitness industry, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And that's a very kind intro. Thanks, by the way. I just generally refer to myself as a consumer. That's kind of how I think of myself. I was very early on caught up in the health and fitness movement back in the 70s when it really kicked off. So I was like a super skinny kid. And I had kind of gotten bit by the bodybuilding bug early because I was so ridiculously skinny. So I started tying like metal bars together in fourth grade, and just, all I knew was like, well, maybe I can curl with these, and trying to do that. And the running craze kind of took off in the mid 70s, and I was kind of, in the middle of that as a kid. And I just noticed after a few sessions doing it, like my quads started to pop a little bit. And I was kind of fascinated by that. So I was like an early avarice. I was just an early reader of every single bodybuilding magazine I could get my hands on. And I was like a super fan, like super nerd fan of bodybuilding. So, I could tell you all the nuances of like the 79 Olympia and Metzner and Zane and, when Tom Platz exploded and, all of the different, just literally everything through the 70s, 80s, 90s. I was just like a nerd for like, did you see that dude, Joseph Gromulus, and the muscularity that guy had? So I just kind of grew up. I grew up around Olympic lifters who were Olympic athletes, and then just picking up on bodybuilding. And so that was kind of like my foray or entree as a consumer was just consuming everything. Like everything I could get my hands on and trying everything when it came out. And so I was just, I was an early adopter just by virtue of just being glued to whatever was coming out. And I've said this before in other podcasts, but there were things like Champion Nutrition came out with an MCT in their product. Before there were meal replacements, there was this thing called Metabolol, which was the metabolic optimizer. And this is actually way ahead of its time. They put MCTs in this like in the late 80s. And on the label, they said the fatless fat. And this was the era where fat was evil. And so that was so ahead of its time. It said on the label, they cannot be stored as fat. And I was just like, what? Because if you think about it back then, a lot of people don't remember, but like back in like 89, 90, 91, everything was no fat, zero fat, low fat, and that was just revolutionary. So I just kind of got caught up in all the trends. And what happened to me on my journey was I ran into a lot of issues just from trying things and doing them for a number of years. So one would be kind of the fasting thing. So in the early 90s, Metrics came out. And it used to be in 2 cans, and I was like an early, adopter buying that. And I got absolutely peeled on that stuff. And it worked so well that that's all I lived on for a number of years. It was just like one meal a day, because I read Jeff Everson wrote in an article, I'm doing one meal at night and then I'm doing Metrics. So I just started doing that. And after a few years, I pretty much like couldn't poop. and ran into a bunch of issues related to just overeating, because I had so disrupted all the hormones that govern eating by not having volume and stomach distension in there. So it just led me down a road of trying different things to correct the initial problems I ran into. And so that led me into like my fresh whole organic phase, and then my macro counting phase, and then my functional food phase. It just led me into a bunch of different phases. The interesting thing that happened to me was I wound up trying to apply all the bodybuilding info under real life circumstances. So I actually wound up running a company as a CEO, and this was in tech, which the dirty little secret of biohacking is that everybody came over from tech. It's kind of the dirty secret. And there's a hubris to it too. Like, now that I'm here, I'm going to figure everything out, It's like, okay. But anyways, I got fat during my tech phase. I mean, the funny thing too was, like, I remember when I first started that job in 2003, I was so peeled. I was in the elevator and I was just kind of looking at my abs like this, and some dude got on and I was like, "Oh, hey, how are you?" Yeah. Yeah. And then within 3 years though, I was just fat. I mean, I gained, like, I was 260 pounds, and I was big because I was, working out a lot. But I was, I was, what you see a lot in the gym, kind of the gym look, which is big pecs, big arms, big chest, big gut, kind of like, small legs. I mean, that was kind of it. So out of that, what led me was really, really, like, was a changing point, a fork in the road for me, because I had devoted my entire life to a system or a philosophy that I just found couldn't work under real life circumstance, and that was like an earth shattering thing for me. So out of that, when I left the tech industry in 2006, I was kind of like Brian Johnson. I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. And that led me ultimately into doing a software program that I created that was based on the microbiome and based on some experiences that I'd had in about 2006, 2007 with different eating patterns that really optimized the microbiome. And I was able to drop fat like ridiculously fast on that. And it was very interesting because, like, my poop didn't smell. Got really lean really fast. And I went down, and here in Orange County, there's one of those places that measures your body fat and water. I went down and had that tested. And I was very, very lean. And so all that for me just led me on this journey where a very long, hard journey where I created this software, and it was just way too advanced for the nutrition people of the day. And we were trying to sell it to hospitals and corporations and cities and all that. And it was an up and down road, like, had some big wins, sold a major hospital chain, sold City of Phoenix, City of Houston, Technicolor, big corporations. And the advantage was by 2013, I'd had about 16,000 people come through that system. And so I had so much raw data on what actually worked and what didn't work that it just, and there were no gut gurus at that point. Didn't even exist. So it just gave me such a head start that I was able to develop some stuff that actually worked out of that. And those protocols became embedded into kind of an ethos, which became my first book. So that's kind of the long and the short of it.
So what we end up having is we have very carefully applied science, but with a huge body of actual evidence from real life practical application. And I find that tends to be where the best information comes from when we're actually combining the two. So you started with this giant subset of real people with real experience, and I'm sure that's only been added to as the years went on and as business expanded. Now, I'm sure we can break down and demonize every single named diet that's out there because, in my opinion, they're all tools and they all have their places. But when you're marrying one particular way of eating, it tends to bring as much bad eventually as it brings good in the beginning. And I've actually heard you touch on that before. But before we kind of zero in on one specific aspect, let's look at kind of like the general approach that people take to what you can call bodybuilding diet. So we're not all bodybuilders, at least in the competitive sense, but generally speaking, the fitness community online has a giant basis of people that just want to better themselves. They want to feel better. They want to look better. Generally speaking, they want to have a little bit more muscle. They want to be a little bit leaner. And if you're absorbing this type of content, chances are your goals are a little bit further than the average person. You want to be a little bit more of a cartoon character, a little bit extra jacked, a little bit extra pumped up, a little bit extra, et cetera, whatever the goal is. So looking at that vocal minority of the competitive bodybuilding tropes, the work more, eat less, increase cardio, decrease carbohydrates. And you see a lot of your basics like chicken breast, white rice, repeat, maybe a steak and potato in the evening. The vegetables are just because we know for some reason we're supposed to have vegetables. There's some broccoli there somewhere. What are the most common issues that you're seeing basically affecting everybody? And then what are some of the more long-term issues, and what is slowing down progress?
Well, first thing to understand, I think, about what you would call a bodybuilding diet, I would probably split it into two phases. One is kind of the pre-keto phase, the pre-low carb phase, and then, kind of what we have today, which is kind of both flavors around. So speaking to the original, which would be, your typical what you think of like Ronnie Coleman would be eating, prior to, so he's eating oats, he's eating egg whites, he's eating, tons of steak, he's eating some vegetables, The thing about it is it works, it absolutely works. And it not only does it, to your point, there've been so many people over the years who've applied that and done it, and it works that, you just have to say, hey, this works. And so what's interesting about that now is there's this plethora of experts who've never trained in their life, ever trained, ever, probably to this day don't train. And now they're sort of giving these expert opinions on things like oats or things like, rice and carbohydrates and things like that. And so to me, and you as well, we've done this our entire life. It's really ridiculous, I think, just to even hear these types of things from people sort of trying to pass expert judgment on something that's worked for literally millions of people. And you go back to some of the bodybuilding gurus, diet gurus like Chris Aceto in the late 80s. These guys just had things figured out. Like they really knew what they were doing. And the stuff that they did actually really worked. Like one of Aceto's techniques was you would stack carbohydrates down based on starchiness going into a contest. So as you got closer and closer to a contest, the glycemic yield of those carbs was getting less and less and less. And so you'd start off with things like bread and you'd wind up with things like vegetables, and these things consistently worked. People were getting peeled, heading into a contest on stuff like that. So what I would say, number one, is there's a large volume of, I would just say, real world data from people who've done it over decades that those things work. They work very well for getting lean and shredded. So the only question then becomes two things. Number one, we're in this era now that sort of vilifies carbohydrates in certain camps, like example, the carnivore camp, to some extent, the keto camp. And so you have to ask the question, well, wait a second. If carbohydrates have been so helpful for so many people, the best ever, like if you go to a person and you look up what they ate, like go look up Andreas Collins, Andreas Munzer's pre-contest diet. Go look it up. You'll see that there were carbs in there. There were oats in there. There were things that are vilified by people. Go look up Ronnie Coleman's. Go look up Sean Ray. Go look up anybody. Okay. And you'll see that there's a very consistent pattern of diet coming down that just works. So when you get into some of these schools that are popular now that show carbs, I would just say the first thing to ask is, well, since we know that this historically works for one objective, which is helping you get lean, and also we can see that, these other diets also help people get lean. The first question you have to ask is two things. One, why would it, long term, is there a cost to leaving carbohydrates out of the picture? And number two, was it really the diet to begin with? Okay. Meaning that changes in the diet can be as powerful as the diet. And this leads into a whole school of thought that I think if people just understood this, it would be better in the long term, which is very often someone new will come in and try a diet and it works amazingly well. And then they'll write a book on it and everybody jumps on that bandwagon and it creates, kind of, I'm thinking of like Paul Saldino, for example. And they've never bothered to factor in that, well, was it the diet or was it the fact that your body had never cut weight before and you made a massive change in your diet? Because that is a thing. A massive change in the diet and never having cut weight before, you're going to see really good results, most people generally speaking. And that's just not generally understood. So I wish that was more understood. But segueing into like kind of a longer term picture, like what's going to bring real and lasting health, I think there's 4 questions everybody should ask. And it gets to, there's 4 things you have to have. You have to have optimal insulin function. So you can't have insulin resistance, you can't have issues with insulin and be healthy. It's just not going to happen. You have to have an optimal cardiovascular system, meaning you need to be able to get oxygen and substrate into cells. And if you can't do that, then you're not going to be healthy. It doesn't matter what. Next is the microbiome. You need to have an optimal microbiome, and if you don't, you're going to have issues. And finally, it's the immune system. You need to have an optimal immune system. If you don't, you're going to have issues. So those are 4 things to look at, and to look at how diet feeds those 4 things, you can begin to quickly see that a lot of things that are popular are going to cause problems long term.
So when we're addressing those 4 things, are the common bodybuilding dieting approaches not necessarily they themselves causing issues there, but the redundancy and the repetitiveness of not changing it? Where do those issues start to arise? Is it lack of diversity? Is it lack of key nutrients? Or is it all of the above?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would offer it's all the above. So one of the things that people who work with people a lot will tell you is that if you eat too much any one thing, eventually you get some kind of autoimmune issue. And you talk to high-level trainers, high-level nutrition people who work with tons of people, and what you see is like, oh, I've just been eating chicken breast, and I ate chicken breast for 5 years in a row, but now I get allergic when I eat chicken. Now it's weird. Well, that's true of anything. It's probably true of anything. Food is foreign matter to the body, and it has to pass the immune checkpoints, like in the gut. So too much of a thing can create issues. The other thing, yeah, to your point, just has to do with variety and diversity in the diet. And coming back to one question, which is, if you accept the premise, and so there's an underlying premise everybody's bought into. And if you follow that premise to its conclusion, it will invalidate almost many of the popular diets today. And that premise everybody's accepted. And if you don't take my word for it, just go inventory anybody that's ever been on our show, and they're all talking about doing things that align with nature, like every single person. Okay. Well, that's based on an idea. The idea is that nature naturally optimizes. That's what that's based on. Okay. It's the notion that nature and humans being in nature, in the rhythms of nature, are going to optimize their physiology. That's what that's based on. So it turns out there's a dietary rhythm that nature forces upon you, and it's based on scarcity. And the second you introduce scarcity, you will introduce diversity into the diet. It's easy to prove, super easy to prove. Like, do a weekend where you're foraging for foods, and what you'll find is that by virtue of scarcity, you're eating a diverse diet of things you normally wouldn't eat. So nature, if you accept the premise that nature optimizes naturally, then logic dictates you must accept what goes along with that, which is nature makes scarcity inevitable, and scarcity by its very nature will drive diversity in the diet. And then when you look at that question and you go, well, does diversity seem to help? Are there health benefits to diversity? Actually, yeah, it's super compelling. Really compelling. Look at, for example, ammonia overload from too much protein. You solve that through diversity. You just simply solve that through diversity. Certain types of carbohydrates, like oats, for example, will help with ammonia accrual, and we'll just spin that down. So you can be on a super high protein diet, add some carbs in there, add some oats, add some things that shift the locus of fermentation in the gut away from protein fermenters, and you solve the ammonia accrual problem. And that's a function of diversity.
So what's very interesting about that is we'll look at the way that coaches will put together diets, or just even people putting together their own diets, with the amount of information that's out there and with a general awareness about how important gut health as a whole is. We are seeing, at least for the majority of the year, people are paying attention to things like prebiotic and probiotic foods. They're paying more attention to fiber. They are paying attention to that diversity. Now, what we tend to see, though, is as somebody's competition date is approaching, or let's say their photo shoot date, or whatever date they're trying to get an optimal physical condition for in terms of body comp and in terms of being lean, that's when that diversity tends to go away. That's when to pull more levers without as many variables, that's when we're kind of settling into the white rice, the chicken breast, the 99% lean ground turkey, because it's easier to control when you're getting down to that minutia detail. But what you're saying is based on just the virtue of how nature works. When scarcity becomes a thing and food intake becomes low, diversity becomes more important. Is there a way to be able to just micromanage a diet when calories are getting really low, but to still take advantage of that diversity and to avoid the pitfalls of, oh no, I changed foods and now I'm having XYZ response. My weight's all over the place. I'm holding water and I'm 2 weeks out from my show. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to kind of get the best of both worlds here?
Yeah, I think so. There's two separate problems here. One is pre-contest dieting and the other is just long-term health. And they don't 100% align for a number of reasons. One reason is just simply the accumulated cost to weight reduction on the body. You talk to people who've done bodybuilding for a long time or people like MMA fighters, and to a person, they'll tell you over time, it gets harder and harder to get really lean. And it's just because there is a cost to forcing the body down to very low body fat levels. And there are adaptive changes in key structures in the body as a result of essentially what amounts to starvation. So those changes over time accrue and make it more difficult the longer you do those things. You talk to guys in their 50s who've done bodybuilding, they're like, hey, it's hard getting lean now. I don't know what's going on. Well, a lot of that is that you've had so many trips to the really low body fat well, these sort of like, contractions and expansions of things like the extracellular matrix that surrounds your fat. That does not exist as a static mechanism. Those structures are variable and they're adaptive by their very nature. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what's he talking about? I'm saying that the things we take for granted, like body fat in and of itself, those are incredibly complex mechanisms. I mean, those are systems. The more I study them, the less I know. I mean, they are so ridiculously complex that for my first book, I had a hard time even writing it down because I'd read so much on how these structures work, things like the extracellular matrix, that it was really difficult to parse it down into just a few chapters. I mean, these structures are so complex. Suffice to say that they are adaptive in their very nature, and they adapt to what you throw at them over time. And the adaptions are all geared at survival. So basically, they make your job tougher if it's pre-contest dieting over many years. There's an accrued effect from that. So there's that. Then juxtaposed to that is just the question of like health, like particularly in a pre-contest scenario. I don't think that a lot of old school bodybuilding diets pre-contest necessarily are unhealthy. I think in many cases they're very healthy. If you look at what kind of was happening in old school, you'd be, as contest gets closer, you're cutting down on your carbs, you're adding in more vegetables and all that stuff. I don't think that's necessarily unhealthy at all. I think that the main question just becomes when you are doing something for very, very long periods, whether that's a carnivore diet or whether that's a low carb diet or, whatever your flavor of crazy is. The problem becomes over very, very, very long periods. I think that becomes the issue. I think in terms of like pre-contest stuff, I don't necessarily think that the diet portion can be super unhealthy as long as it's not protracted that long.
So that brings up a very interesting point, and that's kind of the general difference between getting contest lean and just getting shredded. Because there's two different camps here, and there are the people that believe that there's one way to do everything, and I'll straight up say that's the wrong camp. And then there's the camp that understands that these are completely different things. Like a pre-contest diet isn't necessarily the type of diet that gets you shredded. And some people will say, well, you can get lean or you can get shredded for a bodybuilding show. I would be one to say that you can get absolutely peeled and still have it not be contest lean, and you can still take a different approach to it. So maybe what we look at is we look at the fact that maybe what we have to do is we have to approach a bodybuilding diet with the mindset that those last 6 weeks or so might be something that's a little bit more, you're just expending more energy than you're taking in. It might be a little mundane. It might be the same things over and over again. There might be a lack of diversity there, but it is short term and it is dialing in for one specific purpose. And at the end of the day, depending on the nature of the show you're doing, let's assume it's not a natural federation, there's a whole lot of other unhealthy stuff going on anyways. So we can't lie to ourselves and say we're doing this 100% in the pursuit of health. So let's take a step back and let's look at the person that doesn't necessarily want to get on stage. So let's eliminate those last 6 weeks of just mundane bodybuilding cliches to get absolutely stage ready and peeled. And let's just say I want to be like cartoon character shredded and lean, and I want to dive into that scarcity, but I want to take advantage of that diversity. How would I structure my diet to introduce more diversity as the food's getting lower, as I'm getting more into a state of scarcity? And how often do I want to leave that state? Because I'm not just going to decrease my calories and keep them low for the rest of my life. How do I titrate down? What do I do with the sourcing? And then how do I maintain that level of leanness while bringing food back up occasionally?
Part of that, I think, depends on whether or not you get paid to be fit and whether or not you live in the real world. So those are two separate cases because it's going to create, the real world's going to create constraints that are very difficult for the average person. It's just a different equation. But let's take the case of, your kind of world revolves around being fit. Let's kind of take the case of that. So I don't really necessarily think that's very difficult to do. The way I look at it is, I'll just say how I live, which is I have a day that is more kind of foraging foods looking. And then I have a day that's more kind of like carnivore-ish looking, more protein, fat. And one of those days typically is going to be a low calorie day. I used to do it more on the protein fat day, but what I'm doing of late is making that more on the day with carbohydrates. That's my low calorie day. And it's not hard actually to do at all. And if, depending on what I'm training, I just simply add in a few preload meals or pre and post meals to get the calories where I need them to be, or to get, what I need to be to get through something. But so on that foraging foods day, there's quite a bit of diversity there. Literally everything. So if I were to step you through that day, the morning, there's some fruit. There's some nuts. Depending on how I want to structure it, there could be some grains, there could be some whey protein, but it's very diverse. And then lunch typically is leaning a little bit more towards resistant starches. So there could be like a sweet potato. There could be like a Greek salad, and I can add protein into that. So I just add some chicken. And then dinner, usually the main thing is to get some leafy greens in at dinner. And then protein. So pretty diverse on that day. And then the following day, there's a short fast, and then there's usually a huge, massive lunch that's steak, eggs, avocado. I mean, it's very keto, very carnivore looking. And then dinner is kind of along those same lines, and that's usually a recovery day for me. So I'm getting tons of protein in on that day, and that's a pretty diverse diet, and that's a pretty healthy, pretty diverse diet. What I'll point out in that I think is relevant is those 4 structures I mentioned. I'm accounting for all 4 of those in that. So with age, you have to account for the cardiovascular system. And so the berries and leafy greens are there specifically for that. You have to account for the microbiome. So the breakfast and lunch on that first day is there specifically for that. You have to account for the immune system. And again, a lot of the foods on that first day and then the fast on that second day are designed to tweak that. So during the fasting period, there's special sugars. Something not generally known is that the way to control immune cells is through sugars. And so I can kind of pick and choose different types of sugars. Like I can go with Trailose. I can go with mannose. I can go with different sugars depending on what I need to do. And that actually steers immune cells, which also helps recovery. And down the line. So those 4 structures are accounted for in that basic system. And past that, it's just nailing calories really at the end of the day,
So we have these 2 different days set up, and one of them being very high in things like polyphenols, things like prebiotic fibers and whatnot, like as you mentioned, are taking care of some of those pillars for you. Then with the next day going more into the meats and fats and whatnot, so protein and fat, I should say, is one day better suited for recovery and one day's better suited for output? Because you did mention that you'll adjust the calories on the given day based on the demands of the day, which I'm assuming is based on like physical training or just general need to accomplish tasks. But is there one day that's better for a workout day and one day that's better for a recovery day based on the nutrients you're consuming?
Yeah, the day one typically is the one that's better for the workouts, depending on the workout. And then the day two is better for recovery. That's kind of how I structure it. But it just depends on the workout. Depends on what I'm doing.
Gotcha. Now, how important is the actual nature of the workout based on the type of training? Because if we're doing things like circuits and heavily glycolytic style training and we don't have a lot of carbohydrates in our system, that can create some oxidative stress. So are we choosing our workouts based on our diet, or are we manipulating our diet based on our workouts?
I would say more diet based on workouts. Yeah, the oxidative stress isn't bad. It's actually good. You want that to some degree coming into the first 6 hours post-workout. So there's benefits to fasted training. There's benefits to fed. They both have benefits, and I just mix them. I mix them both in. So I don't really, necessarily favor one or the other. This is no news to you, but in this era, it still dumbfounds me. I have to say this, that there's a lot of benefits to carbohydrates in training. So depending on what you're going to train, it can be very, very helpful to have carbohydrates, depending on your training, depending on what you're doing. So, and that in the era I grew up in, everybody knew that. So to me, to have to say that is almost like, why am I even saying this? It should be, yeah.
So one thing that you mentioned was utilizing different types of carbs based on different types of day, demands for the day and whatnot. And you mentioned trehalose, which I'm a big fan of because there's a multitude of different benefits there, both from a glucose absorption standpoint to just how it affects the rest of your carbohydrates through the rest of the day. So I think it's safe to say all carbs aren't necessarily created equal. How important is carbohydrate diversity to you, and what are some of your favorite carb sources for different tasks?
Yeah, I hate the word carbohydrates because we're in this era. Something in my new book I wrote, this was so important. I had to write 2 chapters on it. And it just has to do with the way that humans have been conditioned to think over the last 100 years is atypical from the way they've thought previous to that. And there's a lot of semantic programming that goes on nowadays. All of us have been kind of, to some degree, subjected to what's called animal training, where the way to control someone is to control their words. You can control the words they use, you can control their mind. And so carbs fit, for me, it's kind of like carbs is this word that gets our minds thinking a certain way, and because it's an umbrella term. But really, when you look at these things we call carbohydrates, I mean, they can be wildly different in terms of their function. In my last book, I actually just took different kinds of pulse crops and went into like, okay, so, this one stimulates PGC alpha, this one stimulates lipolysis, this one drives and there's big differences between starch-based components based on the food matrix that they're embedded in. So that being said, I really like purple sweet potato a lot, just because the phenol content in it is so good. It's when you get into the purples, there's this thing called cyanidin 3 glucoside, which is kind of like the apex phenol, does a lot of good things. So I really like purple sweet potatoes a lot, and particularly like if I'm gonna go train a certain way. It's good to have the muscles loaded up with glycogen with that. Potatoes are great. I love oats because they're just so universally applicable for a lot of things. And oats have been really vilified a lot by guys like Asprey and people like that. But I don't believe that holds up to scrutiny when you look at a lot of the maligning of oats is really a conflation of the grade of food, which is a universal truth all foods suffer from. You can find poor grades of any food, but oats have a lot of benefits, I think. So I love those, but I love them in the morning. I don't love them later in the day.
Can you diffuse that phytic acid fear that's going around based on oats? Because that's what everybody's really harping in on, like it's going to destroy your life in one bowl of oatmeal.
Yeah, so phytic acid's essential. like phytic acid is essential. Like when you look at, you go down the list and look at like what phytic acid impacts in a beneficial way, the whole vilification of phytic acid, you'll come away thinking, where did they get this thing? Okay, so let's start with the pineal. It's pretty important. Okay, one of the best ways to prevent the pineal from calcifying is through phytic acid in the diet. Phytic acid sensitizes insulin. Phytic acid sensitizes, and it does it by sensitizing adiponectin. So it's one of the very few ways you can actually stimulate adiponectin. And on down the line, when you look at the benefits of phytic acid, what's missing in the argument is, in my book that I just wrote, the original name for this thought error was called the Bifidate error, and I thought that's a little too caustic, so I'll change it. I called it the commensal error, and it's a thought error, which is that the mistake, which is clearly visible, readily evident, easy to prove, is that you take in foods with phytic acid and you absorb it. That's not how things work. All those foods you take in have to pass through the microbiome. That's a variable. So if you have a maladaptive microbiome, then you're going to be missing the bacteria that bind, that prevent phytic acid from binding minerals in the gut. Okay. If you have the optimized microbiome, then the whole complaint with phytic acid that it's going to bind minerals in the gut, that goes away. So if you have bifidobacteria, lactobacillus, you have all that, you sidestep that, because those bacteria secrete enzymes that prevent phytic acid from binding minerals in the gut. Then you get actually the reverse happens. You get greater mineral absorption when that happens. So when you have those bacteria in the gut, you're going to better absorb the minerals that you need in the presence of phytic acid. And so when you look at this equation, what you come away with is the foods that have been maligned, like leafy greens and different foods like spinach and all that stuff. Same error with oxalates, exact same error. They left out the role of the microbiome in detoxifying or preventing these issues from happening. So what you have is a systems argument. So the one argument is sort of this hyper reductionistic argument. Black and white baby talk. Oh, phytic acid's bad. Stay away from it. The more advanced argument and the much more accurate one is, no, you're dealing with a system. That system can have a lot of configurations. The optimal configuration solves all the problems and gives you all the benefits. And so that phytic acid argument goes away, and it goes away through diversity in the diet. In fact, the very foods that are vilified are the ones that actually spin up the bacteria that prevent phytic acid and oxalates from doing any harm.
So we have generalized blanket statements being fed into by echo chambers, essentially making people afraid to eat their breakfast, which is so refreshingly redundant of the fitness industry. Now, you mentioned something that I can't let get away. You mentioned carbohydrates for lipolysis. What are some of the carbohydrates that will encourage lipolysis?
Did I say carbohydrates? Did I say that? So carbohydrates are not going to directly stimulate. Well, that's not true. Actually, some do. As a matter of fact, yeah. There actually are. I just had to inventory this in my brain. When you look at pulse crops, certain pulse crops actually can turn up genes that will increase like all of the pathways that are going to support lipolysis. So when you look at, for example, chickpeas, look at black beans, look at soybeans, and they're all going to have different effects on different genes that are involved in fat storage. Soybeans are going to actually potentiate fat storage, but chickpeas are actually going to drive insulin sensitivity, and they're going to drive PPAR gamma, and they're going to drive different pathways that are going to actually support lipolysis. So, it's not a thing of like, oh, you're going to eat, this carbohydrate and get shredded doing that. I would say I've probably experienced that a few times just through extreme dieting. Like I've done some diets that are super extreme. I don't do them anymore, but I've done green beans and egg whites and, gotten peeled on that. Even had measurable ketones, like on if you call green beans a carb, I've done green beans and egg whites and had 3 millimoles of ketones in the serum from doing that, from carbs. Which is, but again, that's just an old Chris Aceto trick. That's just, you take fat to zero, increase your fibers, increase your protein. I mean, there's nothing new with that. That's proven. It works. It's just now we can measure it and quantify it in terms of different ways. But for those things specifically, yeah, I like green beans. I like green beans, chickpeas, onions, any kind of fibrous carb mixed with starchy carbs like slow starches like pulse crops works really well. You're just really managing glycemic load, and the longer you can stretch out your glycemic load over time in the presence of protein and keep fat down, it almost always works.
So I think that's one thing that a lot of people are misunderstanding right now. Can you break down the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, glycemic index is just just sort of like imagine one of those punching machines, where you punch the ball and you get a rating, of how hard your punch was. That's kind of glycemic index. Glycemic load is like how full is the wheelbarrow, like how much stuff is in the wheelbarrow. So in other words, what's the total load on the body in terms of glucose that we're asking it to dispose of? And so those are two completely separate things. They're related, but they're separate.
Gotcha. Now, you did mention purple sweet potatoes as an underrated favorite. Are there any other carbs before we kind of wrap up the chapter on carbohydrates that you think people are missing the boat on? Any really great carbohydrate sources that don't get utilized enough?
Semi-green banana and grapefruit, those two together are really good.
Well, explain the semi-green banana thing to me, because I know that becomes more of a resistant starch at that point in time. So are we doing that more for gut health benefits or performance or a little bit of both?
What I found is that when you combine semi-green banana with grapefruit, they're really good for fat loss. Make you hungry as heck, so you got to kind of offset that. But in my first book, I actually put this out there as something you can prove. So the proof is take a day and just eat semi-green banana and grapefruit and watch what happens. And almost universally, what everybody reports by the end of the day is it's like they drank 12 cups of coffee. I mean, pretty consistently. Like they can't go to bed that night. In fact, I have a caution in there, have some cough syrup standing by because you're going to be wired by the time. And that's because you have two synergistic things going on. You have AMP-K activation through grapefruit, and then you have the resistant starch from the semi-green banana, and those two work together very much. And so if there ever was a case for saying carbohydrates can drive fat loss, that combination would be kind of at the top of the list. And what I like about it is you don't have to take my word for it. Go try it. Just go try it. Watch what happens.
So is AMPK activation in the presence of a resistant starch something that kind of just hypercharges the whole process, or what's going on under the hood in that case?
So the bacteria that are going to be spun up. So the first thing to understand is that this is really fascinating when you get into it. Nature has provided a way where the foods you eat in a foraging state, which are things that are less preferential, meaning it's not your first pick. Like if you stick a big old ribeye in front of me and then you stick some resistant starch, I'm going to eat the ribeye. Okay. But if I'm really hungry, I'll eat the resistant starch. Well, it turns out the bacteria that are spun up typically by resistant starches, those bacteria mimic one-to-one the same pathways activated during fasting. So what you'll find is those bacteria turn up AMPK, they turn up, all these different things that you see during fasting. They're very synergistic. And so what you see with semi-green banana, it tends to spin up bifidobacteria. It's highly bifidogenic. And then bifidobacteria will cross-feed everything else. And you get this AMP-K activation from it. Well, that's what grapefruit does. Grapefruit's an AMP-K activator. And so you're just kind of hitting AMP-K from two separate pathways that mimic nature, that mimic what you see in nature. And if you think about it, there's actually a function to that, which is the function of, in nature, starvation is it will force you to eat anything you can find, typically less preferential things, usually roots. And it actually helps you keep you alive, because that's when those bacteria that are spun up by this, they're very health promoting. They help drive autophagy. They help drive all the benefits of fasting are exponentiated by that. So there's actually a health benefit in nature to eating less preferential foods in a starved state, and you can mimic that.
So some of these combinations I feel are so fascinating based on just combining mechanisms of action. You have another one in your book about simply grilled cheese before bed to induce sleep, which I've basically tried because I wanted to have a grilled cheese and justify the reasoning behind it, but it actually works. Like, what are some other combinations? Like, give me some more of these combos that people might be missing the boat because they're not traditional bodybuilding foods, air quotes for anybody that's just listening. But what are some other things that we can combine to get these very noticeable effects?
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. It's combining foods for functional outcomes, and in my old nutrition system, that was a big part of the appeal. Which, by the way, on that grilled cheese thing, I like to do things that are testable. Like don't take my word for it. I'm just a dumb consumer. Go test it and see if it works. And literally, I don't think I've ever heard anybody come back and say that didn't work. It actually works, which flies in the face of a lot of research of like, oh, don't eat before bed. That's bad, blah, blah, blah. And well, they neglected to point out that it's better to sleep. It's much better to sleep deep than not. So that really works, and anybody can prove it to themselves.
So what's going on there for anybody that hasn't heard of that? Because we're ranting about how awesome it is, and people at home might be like, what the hell are they talking about? Like, what's going on there? What's the short of it?
Yeah, it works on a lot of different levels. So there's peptides. There's very specific peptides in dairy. There's DDP. I forget the exact peptide name, but there's a few peptides that are sleep promoting in cheese. So that's one level that it works at. Then there's the tryptophan load you're getting from that. Then there's the glycemic load that you're getting from that. All those things work together at the same time to help sleep onset. And particularly for people who've got spun up cortisol at night, there's this big wave of cortisol reduction that comes from something like a grilled cheese, because you're just getting this, oh yeah, factor going down. And it just works on about 3 or 4 different levels. The peptides are probably the most interesting one. It's really underappreciated, which is the sleep peptides in dairy. And so to your point, another one in the new book that takes advantage of that and kind of makes it takes it a little farther is you can do the same thing with mac and cheese, and you can actually improve it a little bit by adding nutmeg into there. Nutmeg has myristicin, and it's kind of it's essentially a drug. And if you add not too much, but just enough, it really helps sleep quite a bit.
Amazing. So mac and cheese as a sleep improving supplement, which could have a multitude of various carryover benefits as well. But it just comes from understanding what's in these items and what they do and what they work and how to combine them. So I'll shamelessly plug your books as it is. I mean, I showed you before just to put the proof in the pudding, but the Immunity Code in the Way, I picked these up as they came out. I did not just buy them for this podcast. I'm not that dedicated to my craft, but there's a ton of stuff in there. And usually I do the product plugs at the end to just kind of like, hey, if you want more, dive into it. We'll get there. But I can't not mention it based on that, just because these are two things that I guarantee you, if somebody's watching this podcast and they haven't already absorbed your content, they haven't heard of that before. And these are legitimate, actionable things that work, and it's incredible. One other thing that I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to touch on was something that's becoming very topical in not only bodybuilding, but just general performance, and that's the mitochondria. So we have this plethora of mitochondrial support supplements and peptides and practices. What exactly are the mitochondria doing, and why are they important, and how do we optimize them from your point of view?
So the first thing to understand is that I use this term a lot. I call it 10 years ago nutrition. And the reason I throw that term out is because there's information available right now that either overturns or greatly expands upon the idea that we have of how something works. But yet we're stuck in these 10 years old sort of tropes of what a thing is and how it works. And they're everywhere, which is just, to my mind, it's like completely stupid. Why are we stuck in this? And mitochondria fits squarely into that. So the first thing to understand about the mitochondria is that we've been kind of taught that they are this apex mechanism of the human system. And that's the 10 years ago idea. So when you really look at the mitochondria, what you find is that they are part of a system in the same way that, think of it this way. Think of your V8 or your V6 in your car, and then think of your starter motor. Okay, the car's not going to work without the starter motor, and it's not going to work without the V6. They both need to work together in a system that drives propulsion. That's the point, right? So take that analogy and now apply it to the mitochondria and the peroxisomes. Okay, and so the peroxisomes are kind of the forgotten energy organelle of the cell, and the kind of the older understanding of them was that, well, they help us with long chain fats. So they take long chain fats and they produce energy. But a much more accurate, much more updated picture is that the mitochondria and the peroxisomes form a single system, and they actually share parts and they share components, and that the health of the one drives the biogenesis of the other. So that once you begin to get this more accurate picture in your brain, it's going to change your actionables. And so let me give you an example. The mitochondria, one of the discoveries about the mitochondria are MDVs, which are mitochondria-derived vesicles. These are exosomes essentially within the cell, and the mitochondria can load stuff in them, and then they can communicate with other organelles and do things with other organelles. Okay. Well, one of the discoveries is that there's a lot of bidirectional traffic between the mitochondria and the peroxisomes, and interestingly, they share parts. So the mitochondria, it's already known the mitochondria share parts through what's known as fission and fusion. So fusion is when a mitochondria will fuse with another mitochondria, and then they kind of, they go, okay, well, this part's not working, but you've got a good one. I'll share that one, and you're lacking this thing, and I'll give you that. So they kind of share parts, they heal, and then they do fission, they split. So the thing to understand is that you don't want too much fusion, you don't want too much fission. You kind of want an optimal amount of those. Well, it turns out when you look at fission, what happens with age is that the membrane on the peroxisomes begins to get damaged, just like the mitochondrial membrane gets damaged with age. The thing that's underappreciated is how catastrophic that is for the mitochondria. So the peroxisomes have these transport proteins called PEX proteins. There's like PEX 1 through 16, as far as I know. And these PEX proteins are involved in transporting stuff. Typically hydrogen peroxide into the interior of the peroxisomes. So what happens with age is the peroxisome membrane gets wonky, and then the hydrogen peroxide content inside the cell goes up, and that is catastrophic for everything. It's catastrophic for the mitochondria. It's catastrophic for everything in the cell because, and that's why you get gray hair, is because you've got too much hydrogen peroxide. So what's interesting is the way they share parts and how that affects mitochondrial biogenesis. For example, when you look at fission, there are proteins under the umbrella of what's called dynamin. One of them is called DRP1, and DRP1 is a fission protein that is shared between the mitochondria, the peroxisomes and the mitochondria. So what happens with age is as the PEX proteins in the peroxisomes begin to get damaged in the membrane, then too many of these fission proteins get shared with the mitochondria. Too many DRP1 proteins get shared. And then what that does is it kills mitochondrial biogenesis, stops it. Okay. So now that's universal. And what we have here now is a completely different picture for this whole system. Notice I'm not calling it the mitochondria, I'm calling it a system, because we've left out the starter motor. And now what I'm just adding in is, no, there's a starter motor. And if the starter motor doesn't work, you can't turn the engine on. Okay. That's exactly the analogy of what happens. So with age, as the peroxisome membrane gets damaged, too many fission proteins get shared with the mitochondria, stops mitochondrial biogenesis. Then the peroxisomes can't take hydrogen peroxide, turn it into water, so you get too much hydrogen peroxide in the cytosol, and then that wrecks everything. Okay, that becomes a much more accurate picture of what's going on than what we've been told, and it completely changes the approach. How do we fix this? What do we do? How do we fix this? So what I'm doing for that is Lactoferrin. And this is just Joel. This isn't, it's not supported in the literature, only indirectly, but it's just, I kind of have a history of, kind of going down this one road, and later on it turns out, that kind of does seem to be some validity to that. So the reason I'm using Lactoferrin is that Lactoferrin has two words, lacto and ferrin. Ferrin is iron. It's under the umbrella of ferritin, which is iron binding proteins. And one of the massive issues we get with age is iron. Iron begins to accumulate. You get excess iron. And nobody's come up with a good answer for that. Like basically it's just 16th century bloodletting, like go and donate blood. That's the answer, right? Well, that's so 10 years ago nutrition. Like Lactoferin's the answer for that. What Lactoferrin does is Lactoferin's iron binding capacity is like 18 times that of other ferritin proteins. So, and it does a lot of other things. I mean, it's in the science, it's called a miracle molecule. I would go so far to say that Lactoferrin is probably the most important biological human molecule, probably more so than NAD, because NAD you can kind of get by just improving your sleep. Lactoferrin becomes a real issue. What you see with lactoferrin is that it gets really good at binding iron in places that it shouldn't be and putting it back into the serum, so it increases oxygenation. But a byproduct of that is it lowers hydrogen peroxide in the cytosol. Okay, so you can think of lactoferrin as sort of a ancillary or backup lever you can pull when iron overload becomes an issue with age, which it's going to become an issue for everybody. Okay, particularly if you're on a high protein diet. So what you find is that lactoferrin's iron binding capacity helps lower hydrogen peroxide in the cell. And then the net effect of lowering hydrogen peroxide in the cell is these other things that are taking place, like too much fission going on and damage to the mitochondrial membranes. And keep in mind, excess hydrogen peroxide in the cytosol is just disastrous for everything. It's because it's a free radical. So when you have excess iron in the presence of excess hydrogen peroxide, okay, so lactoferrin is kind of like the readily available thing that can address that. And that's kind of what I'm doing.
So are we supplementing with this specifically, or are there natural sources we should be looking through, probiotic foods, or how should we be getting this?
I'm supplementing with it. You can get lactoferrin just through dairy. I mean, that's kind of the idea. That's one of the benefits that's missing in the vilification of dairy was, hey, it has lactoferrin. Maybe we would rethink that one. Dairy might be good after all. So I've always done both. Not always. I mean, I've always had dairy in the diet, for that reason and a number of others. Taken a lot of heat for it, by the way. But now what I'm doing is I'm supplementing with lactoferrin as well.
Now, supplementally, how much should we be going for? Is there too much? Should we just be mega dosing it? Like, how should we find the appropriate dose for us? Should it be based on our diet?
So it depends if you're using bovine lactoferrin or human lactoferrin. Bovine lactoferrin, you're going to need a lot more because the receptors in the gut, somewhere between 30 to 50% of them don't recognize bovine lactoferrin, and it actually can trigger an immune response because it's foreign. Human lactoferrin, you need much less. And so I'm doing roughly 100 to 300 milligrams a day of that.
Now, based on its mechanism of action within the cell and based how this is kind of like spilling out to the entire integrity of the cell and how it works, we should be noticing quite a bit putting this in, especially a little bit later in life, or if we have any sort of suspected damage or stress to the cells. Like, this could be right up there with your things like your mitochondrial peptides or at least mitochondrial supplement uses, especially if there's a pre-existing amount of damage. What should people expect to notice from supplementing with this?
Well, I'll tell you what I've noticed. And by the way, there's a missing framework that I think should be said because we just hit the umbrella of supplements and peptides and all that. The missing framework is that most things work on a curve. Okay, most things are going to work like incredibly well in the early going, not so noticeable later. Most things tend to work that way. Like for me, BPC 157 works like that. I don't even feel it anymore. NMN, when I first started taking it, was like, wow, energy juice, and I don't feel anything anymore on it. Mm-hmm. So most things work that way. But I can tell you what I've noticed with it. Initially, just noticed energy, like wow, really energetic, which makes sense because you have more iron available for hemoglobin now with lactoferrin. The other things that I noticed were certain issues that just went away immediately, what a lot of people will report is gray hair starts to go away with lactoferrin. That's actually kind of common. So but the benefits for lactoferrin are so vast that I'm knee deep in researching this of late, so I'm kind of like awash in like, oh my gosh, why haven't we been more into this? It's insane. Like if you read the research on it, and the research is more gushing than I am. It's like this is a miracle molecule, blah blah, and all that. So it's comprehensive. It affects the immune system, affects all the mechanisms that affect aging, it solves the iron accrual, iron overload problem, solves all kinds of things.
So this might be one good for bodybuilders or people using hormone replacement therapy that are seeing increases in hematocrit levels, because by making the blood more efficient, we should see those numbers come down, should we not?
I think everybody should be on lactoferrin. Yeah, over a certain age, particularly. Yeah, because think about it. Well, as babies, that's what you got from mom. Mm-hmm. You got lactoferrin in breast milk. That's where you got it. So
that is a phenomenal take home. Like that's something that people can add in almost immediately and see a multitude of benefits, especially like you mentioned, dairy is unfortunately villainized. So most of us aren't getting enough of it in our diet. So just filling in that gap should make some meaningful changes in and of itself. That is absolutely phenomenal. Joel, this has been such an amazing podcast because we've gotten so many take homes that people can add in. Before we wrap things up, if somebody's trying to optimize their gut health, we have so many different supplements out there and so many different ways to attack things. I know you do have your own line of products. What are some low-hanging fruit products or foods that people should be adding in at least a few times a year, if not in regularly, just to make sure that they're optimizing their digestion? And we're talking about if somebody doesn't have any specific digestion problems, we don't have any diagnosis, maybe a little bit of IBS, maybe things just aren't perfect. What should we have in there and how regularly should we be using these things?
Great question. So first thing is eliminate the word daily. That is the single biggest error / scam / point of stupidity that pervades the whole thing is the idea of daily. So in nature, you're not going to daily be consuming foraging foods. Okay. You're just not. You're going to have a season where, we killed a water buffalo. Yeah, we're eating steak for the next 6 weeks. Okay. And you might supplement it in with a few herbs and things like that, but there's going to be this variety, okay, that's taking place. So I see a lot of talk about things like, fermented foods and kefir and all this. And, what's missing, it's the same thought error of like, oh my gosh, it's only good. Can't be bad. Yeah, it is. You can get a buildup of biogenic amines from too much fermented foods, and that's bad. Okay. So by eliminating the word daily, and just the way I do it in my whole universe is that 3 days a week, you're having foods that are essentially substrate for the two key bacteria that I talked about in my first book, which is Akkermansia and bifidobacteria. And those are a pretty straight up family of foods, things that influence that. They're berries, they are resistant starches, dairy, things like that. They are cruciferous vegetables. Those are things that drive either Akkermansia or bifido or both, and then combine that with a little bit of fasting on the second day, which drives Akkermansia, but not too much fasting. That's one of the problems with too much fasting is you make too much Akkermansia, which is starvation, and then it wipes the gut lining out. Okay. So this sort of balance of not too much, not too little, is kind of the foundational way to think about the problem. And then what I would not do is I would not do probiotics on a regular basis. I would not supplement for Akkermansia. I would not be, almost everything that's out there isn't coming from someone who has done it for 20 years and with large numbers of people to see, was this a good idea? None of it. Almost all of it is stuff that, some entrepreneur decided, well, this should be good, so I'll come out with this. But they don't know the long-term effects of it. A big example is I'm seeing these Akkermansia supplements out there. That's the stupidest thing you could do, like a supplement with Akkermansia. Number one, you don't need to. You can just feed it through substrate. That's the best way to do it. And number two, it might do more harm than good because these are not... these Akkermansia bacteria that are being engineered, they're not 100% native to the human gut. There's changes that have been made to those things. And I can say that about just about almost everything. Probiotics can be used selectively, but I only use them, very selectively for like a couple weeks. Like I have a gut reset and we do that, takes anywhere between 10 to 20 days. And for some cases, it makes sense, like add in a bifidobacteria supplement while you're doing that. That makes sense, but then go off it. And we're in this phase now where everything has probiotics added into it. And a lot of those are not even native to the human gut, like these spore-forming bacteria, the Bacillus coagulans, all that. If you read the research on that stuff when it first came out back in the mid-2000s, it was garbage. It was paid for research. I would never take that stuff. I would never take anything not native to the human gut. So I don't know why that's such a big deal. Really, the rule of thumb is substrate. The rule of thumb is just feed those bacteria what they need, which is in my gut reset, which is the only one in the world that was tried on tens of thousands of people before it was ever put into a book. Like all that happened years before it came out. Apple peels were like the perfect substrate to feed bacteria, the right bacteria in the gut. And it works, so that's kind of a game changer in that apple peels, I don't need a supplement. I can just use apple peels. Yeah.
Perfect. And I do actually have your green apple peel supplement as well for when I'm not eating a bunch of apples also. So that's one of those things where I want to make sure that I always am getting in one way or another. So, but again, I'm not supplementing these things every single day. So there was one that was recommended a while ago that I believe you had a protocol with green apple peel and HMO.
It's red apple peel. Yeah. So the immunity code gut
Red
protocol.
apple peel. I'm sorry. Yes.
The immunity code gut protocol is apple peels, HMO, resistant starch, and you do that for 10, 20 days. And then in recent years, I've added in a couple other things that help from the other end, which is basically NAC glycine, alpha ketoglutarate. Those things help different angles of the gut. So.
Excellent. Great combination of stuff to have. Joel, this has been such an amazing podcast. And again, we've gotten so many actionables that people can take home and use immediately. Your 2 books, The Immunity Code and The Way, absolutely fantastic. Where else can people find you? What else can people get a hold of to absorb your information and learn more from you?
So I've created, so if you go to my Instagram, which is Real Joel Green, that's kind of my main watering hole. I've created a free course that takes the concepts of the first book and just makes them into like 8 simple steps. And it's completely free. So, and that's something I'd always wanted to do, was make all that free. I would say that's probably a good place to start. And then, you know, if you haven't read the books, pick them up and check them out. I'm trying to build my Twitter, my X. So same handle, Real Joel Green on there. Follow me there.
Okay, perfect. Joel, again, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please jump on all these platforms and follow Joel. He is very active on social media, and he's very active behind the scenes doing more research and putting out more information constantly. Pick up the books, follow him there, and tune in next time on the DDT Method podcast. Thanks for watching.